Hey you, I'm talking to you. What do you think you're doing here with these kids?
I'm telling them a story.
Why?
Is there a problem, officer?
Yeah, there's a problem. I suspect you're here to snatch one of them.
And what makes you think that?
I mean, looking at you.
Interesting. What do you mean by looking at you?
It was a beautiful afternoon in the city park where the sun was shining down brightly on the green grass and the birds were singing their songs in the trees without a care in the world. The weather was perfect for a picnic and families were scattered all over the lawn with their colorful blankets and baskets full of sandwiches and juice boxes. Among the people enjoying the fresh air was a man named Jack, who was walking slowly along the paved path with a relaxed smile on his face because he finally had a day off from his very stressful job. Jack was a tall black man with broad shoulders and a kind face that showed he had seen a lot in his life, but still kept a warm heart for the people in his community. He was not wearing a uniform today, but was dressed simply in a plain t-shirt and comfortable jeans because he just wanted to blend in and enjoy the peace and quiet of the park. As he walked past a wooden bench near the playground, he noticed a group of young children sitting together while their parents were chatting a few feet away. The kids looked a little bored and were just kicking their legs back and forth until Jack stopped and decided to switch into his dad mode because he had a lot of time on his hands and he loved making children smile. Before we go any further into this intense story, I want to know where you are all watching from, so please drop your location right now in the comment section below. Jack sat down on the edge of the bench near the children and asked them if they wanted to hear a story about a brave lion who lived in a magical forest. The children's eyes lit up with excitement and they all nodded their heads eagerly because they loved stories, and Jack had a deep and soothing voice that was perfect for storytelling. He began to weave a tale about the lion and his friends, and soon the kids were completely glued to his every word. They were laughing and gasping at the exciting parts, and for a moment, everything was perfect and pure in that little corner of the park. Jack felt a sense of peace washing over him as he watched the joy on their faces, and he forgot all about the paperwork and the politics and the difficult decisions he had to make every single day at his job. He was just a friendly neighbor sharing a moment of happiness with the younger generation. The parents nearby looked over and smiled because they could see that this big man was gentle and kind, and the children were safe and happy in his presence. But not everyone saw the scene with the same eyes because a patrol car was slowly cruising down the street that ran alongside the park. Inside the car was a white police officer named Tony who was feeling bored and looking for something to do to make his shift go by faster. Tony considered himself a tough cop who could spot trouble from a mile away, but the truth was that he often made judgments based on what people looked like rather than what they were actually doing. He slowed his car down when he saw the group on the bench, and his eyes narrowed as he focused on Jack sitting there with the children. Instead of seeing a nice moment between a community member and some kids, Tony's mind immediately jumped to a dark and terrible conclusion because of his own prejudices. He did not see a storyteller. He saw a large black man sitting too close to children who did not look like him. Tony decided right then and there that something criminal was happening and that he was going to be the hero who stopped it. He pulled his patrol car over to the curb and parked it aggressively with the tires crunching against the gravel. Tony stepped out of the car and adjusted his belt with a sense of authority because he wanted everyone in the park to know that the law had arrived. He walked across the grass with heavy steps and his hand rested near his holster as if he expected a fight to break out at any second. The parents stopped talking and looked at the officer with confusion because they did not understand why he looked so angry on such a lovely day. Jack was just reaching the best part of the story where the lion saves the day, but he stopped speaking when he saw the shadow of the officer looming over him. Jack looked up calmly and saw the badge and the uniform and the angry expression on Tony's face. Jack knew exactly what this was because he had seen it many times before in his career and in his life. He did not look scared or guilty, which only made Tony more suspicious because Tony expected people to be nervous when he walked up to them. The silence that fell over the bench was thick and uncomfortable as the children looked from the nice storyteller to the angry policeman. Tony stood with his legs apart and demanded to know what Jack was doing there with those kids. Jack kept his voice low and steady and simply said he was telling them a story. Tony scoffed at this answer because he did not believe that a man like Jack would just be telling stories to strangers in a park for no reason. He asked Jack if he knew these children or if he was related to them. Jack shook his head and admitted that he did not know them personally, but was just passing the time. This was the answer Tony was waiting for because in his mind, it confirmed his worst suspicions. He took a step closer and accused Jack of trying to lure the children away. Jack remained sitting and looked Tony directly in the eyes and asked him what made him think such a terrible thing. Tony let out a short and mocking laugh and said those words that revealed exactly what was in his heart. He said, "I mean, looking at you? Do you think that was fair? If you think the officer was judging him based on his looks, type yes in the comments." Jack took a deep breath because he felt the anger rising inside him, but he knew that losing his temper would only make the situation worse. He tried to explain that he was a member of the community and that the parents were sitting right there watching everything. He pointed to the parents who were now walking over with worried looks on their faces. But Tony was not listening to reason anymore because he had already made up his mind that he had caught a predator. He told Jack to stand up and turn around because he was placing him under arrest for suspicion of kidnapping and disturbing the peace. The parents tried to intervene and tell the officer that everything was fine and that the man was just telling stories, but Tony held up his hand and silenced them. He told them that they should be thanking him for saving their children from a dangerous man. He was so convinced of his own righteousness that he could not see the reality of the situation. Jack stood up slowly and he towered over Tony by a few inches, which made the officer feel threatened. Tony grabbed Jack's arm roughly and spun him around. He pulled Jack's wrist behind his back and slapped the metal handcuffs on him with unnecessary force. The metal clicked tightly against Jack's skin and it pinched him, but he did not flinch or cry out. He knew that everything was being recorded on Tony's body cam, which was attached to the center of his chest. Jack looked at the camera lens for a brief second as if he was making a mental note that this little device would be his witness later on. The children started to cry because they were scared to see their new friend being treated like a bad guy. Jack looked over his shoulder and told the kids not to worry and that everything would be okay. He was more concerned about their feelings than his own freedom at that moment. Tony marched Jack across the grass towards the patrol car while people in the park took out their phones and started recording the scene. Tony felt proud of himself because he thought he was showing the public that he was doing his job and cleaning up the streets. He pushed Jack down into the backseat of the car and slammed the door shut with a loud bang that echoed through the park. Jack sat in the cramped backseat with his hands cuffed behind him, and he watched through the window as the scenery passed by. He stayed completely silent during the ride to the station. He did not beg for mercy, and he did not shout threats, and he did not try to argue anymore. His silence was powerful and heavy. Tony kept looking in the rearview mirror and making comments about how criminals always think they can get away with things until a real cop shows up. He was talking to fill the silence because deep down he was starting to feel a tiny bit of unease at how calm his prisoner was. Usually people who get arrested are screaming or crying or bargaining, but Jack just sat there like a statue made of stone. They arrived at the police station and Tony pulled into the garage with a sense of victory. He pulled Jack out of the car and led him through the back entrance where they processed the people who have been arrested. They walked down the long hallway with the bright fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of old coffee and floor wax in the air. Tony pushed Jack towards the front desk where the booking sergeant was sitting behind a high counter working on a computer. The station was busy with officers walking back and forth and phones ringing in the background. Tony cleared his throat loudly to get the sergeant's attention because he wanted to brag about the arrest he had just made. The sergeant was an older man who had been working at the station for 30 years, and he knew every single person in the department. He kept typing for a moment before he slowly looked up to see who Tony had brought in. When his eyes landed on Jack, his fingers froze on the keyboard and his mouth dropped open in absolute shock. The color drained from his face, and he stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a crash. The noise made everyone else in the room stop what they were doing and look over. Tony did not notice the sergeant's reaction at first, and he started to recite the charges. He said he found this man in the park trying to kidnap children and that he had to use force to detain him. He was smiling as he said it because he expected a pat on the back. But then he noticed that the room had gone deadly silent. No one was moving. No one was speaking. Every officer in the room was staring at Jack with wide eyes. The sergeant came around the counter and walked up to them with shaky hands. He looked at Tony and asked him in a terrified whisper if he had any idea who he had just put in handcuffs. Tony looked confused and said it was just some guy from the park. The sergeant shook his head violently and looked at Jack with an expression of pure apology. He then turned to Tony and shouted that this man was the chief of police for their entire city. Tony felt his heart stop beating for a second. The world seemed to spin around him as the words sank into his brain. He looked at the man he had arrested. He looked at the calm face and the steady eyes, and suddenly he recognized him. This was Jack, the chief, the man who signed his paychecks, the man who was in charge of every single officer in the department. Tony had never met him in person because the chief usually worked in the main headquarters uptown, but he had seen his picture on the wall during orientation. Jack finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried more power than any shout. He simply told the sergeant to take the cuffs off. The sergeant scrambled to find the key, and his hands were shaking so much that he dropped it once before he finally managed to unlock the metal bracelets. Jack rubbed his wrists where the red marks were visible, and he looked at Tony, who was now trembling with fear. Tony tried to stammer out an apology and said he was just doing his job and that it was a mistake. Jack did not yell. He did not scream. He just looked at Tony and told him that he was relieved of his duty immediately. He said that a man who judges people based on how they look and who terrifies children in a park has no business wearing a badge. He ordered the other officers to take Tony's badge and his gun right there in the lobby. Tony stood there in shock as his fellow officers, the people he thought were his friends, stepped forward and stripped him of his authority. He was now the one who looked like a criminal. But the story did not end there because Jack knew that simply firing Tony was not enough to fix the damage that had been done. He knew that if this had happened to him, the chief of police, then it must be happening to regular citizens all the time. He decided to make an example out of this situation to ensure that justice was truly served. The body cam footage from Tony's chest was pulled and reviewed by the Internal Affairs Department and the district attorney. The video showed everything clearly. It showed Jack sitting peacefully. It showed the children laughing. It showed Tony approaching with aggression. It captured the audio of the parents saying everything was fine. And most importantly, it captured Tony saying, looking at you as his reason for the arrest. The footage was damning. There was no way to hide the truth. Tony was charged with false imprisonment, assault, and violation of civil rights. The trial was the talk of the town, and everyone was glued to the news to see what would happen. Tony tried to say he made an honest mistake, but the video proved that he acted with malice and prejudice. The jury did not take long to decide because the evidence was right there in front of their eyes. Tony was found guilty on all charges. The judge spoke harshly about the abuse of power and sentenced Tony to 8 years in federal prison. While Tony was being led away in handcuffs, the same way he had led Jack away, the reality of his actions crashed down on him. He had lost his freedom, his career, and his reputation, all because he couldn't see past his own bias. But Jack did not stop with just the criminal trial. He filed a lawsuit against the department and the city, not because he wanted the money for himself, but because he wanted to force the system to change. He won a massive settlement in the millions of dollars. Jack took that money and he did something wonderful with it. He did not buy a big mansion or a fancy car. He went back to the park where it all happened, and he donated the money to build a brand new community center right next to the playground. He made sure it was a place where kids could come after school to learn and play and be safe. He hired the best teachers and bought thousands of books. He even set up a reading corner with comfortable benches where anyone could sit and tell stories. The lawsuit also forced the police department to completely change how they train their officers. They had to go through rigorous courses on how to treat people with respect and how to avoid judging people based on appearance. Jack stayed on as chief for many more years, and he made sure that every single officer under his command understood that their job was to protect the people, not to scare them. Years later, Jack retired, and he spent his days doing exactly what he loved. He would go to the community center in the park, sit on the bench, and read stories to the children. But this time, no one interrupted him. The police cars that drove by would slow down, and the officers would wave respectfully because they knew that the man on the bench was a hero who stood up for what was right. Tony sat in his small cell and had a lot of time to think about that sunny afternoon. He thought about how easy it would have been to just walk away or to simply wave at the man reading to the kids. He realized that his own hate was the prison he had built for himself long before he was ever locked up. He learned the hard way that you cannot judge a book by its cover, and you certainly cannot judge a man by his skin. If you are glad that justice was served in the end, leave a heart emoji in the comments section. It is important that we share stories like this so that we can learn and be better to one another. The world is a big place with room for everyone, and it takes all of us to make it a safe and happy place for the children to grow up in. Thank you for watching this story to the end.